It was supposed to be just another morning. A black teenager stepped into the hallway of a new school, his backpack slung over one shoulder, a notebook clutched in his hand. He wore a simple hoodie, hood down, eyes scanning the classroom numbers. He looked calm, focused, maybe a little nervous. Then came the voice, sharp, loud, uninvited. "Where do you think you're going?" A man stood across the corridor, his posture rigid, face stern. The principal. He didn't ask for a name, didn't offer a greeting. Just a glare and a tone that left no room for welcome. The boy froze. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. Not because he was guilty, but because he didn't expect to be accused before he even said hello. It was the first day of the school year at Northbridge Academy. The parking lot still smelled like fresh asphalt, and inside, the air held that faint new paper scent, clean, ordered, expectant. Students shuffled through wide corridors in crisp uniforms, greeting familiar faces, exchanging summer stories. Teachers stood by their doors with practiced smiles, watching the flow of returning students settle into the rhythm of a new term. But for Marcus Daniels, none of this felt familiar. He had never set foot in this school before. Transferring from another district, he didn't come from a long line of Northbridge alumni, didn't know which stairwell led to the science wing, or which hallway shortcut avoided the morning rush. All he had was a folded paper map, a scribbled schedule, and a vague idea that room 207 was somewhere down the east wing. The main office had been too busy to do more than hand him the basics. "Your ID will be ready by lunch," the secretary had said, without looking up. "Just head to homeroom for now. No escort, no orientation, just instructions and the unspoken assumption that he'd figure it out." He moved through the hall slowly, reading the door numbers, trying to make sense of the layout. His hoodie hung loose over his shoulders, and he clutched a spiral notebook like a guidepost. He didn't make eye contact. Not because he was shy, but because he already felt eyes on him. Students glanced at him in passing, some with mild curiosity, others with quiet judgment. A few teachers looked his way, their expressions unreadable. No one smiled. No one said, "Hi." Marcus noticed. He noticed everything. The uniformity of the place was jarring. Matching blazers, clean-cut hair, name tags hanging on school-issued lanyards. He had none of it. Without his ID badge, he was just a figure out of place, an unverified presence walking halls that didn't expect him. He didn't know yet where to turn for the East Wing. Didn't know that room 207 was tucked behind the music room, down a hallway most freshmen never used. Every step felt uncertain, every corner a guess. But what weighed heavier than confusion was the silence. Not just in volume, but in feeling. No one asked if he needed help. No one offered directions. And that silence said more than words ever could. In a school where everyone seemed to know the rules, the paths, and each other, he was a stranger. And in places like Northbridge, strangers don't go unnoticed. The principal's footsteps were sharp and purposeful as he approached. His eyes scanned Marcus from head to toe, hoodie, sneakers, no visible ID. He didn't introduce himself, didn't ask if Marcus needed help, just stopped, crossed his arms, and spoke with clipped impatience. "Where's your student badge?" Marcus paused, adjusted the notebook in his hand, then answered with quiet politeness, "I'm new. I transferred this week. They said my ID would be ready by lunch. I'm just trying to find room 207. His voice wasn't defensive, just honest. But honesty didn't matter here. The principal narrowed his eyes. He said slowly, like Marcus had already been caught in a lie. "You're just looking for a classroom? With no ID? On your first day?" Marcus nodded, staying calm. "Yes, sir." But the principal didn't nod back. He shook his head slightly, almost like he was already tired of the conversation. From behind him, a staff member leaned toward another and whispered, just loud enough to reach Marcus's ears, "They always have an excuse." No names were used, but Marcus knew what they meant. And so did everyone else who heard it. He kept his face still, jaw tight. He wanted to speak up, to say he had done nothing wrong, but experience taught him that being calm was safer than being right. The principal didn't ask for his name, didn't check the roster, didn't radio the front desk. Instead, he took one step to the side, extended his arm toward the hallway, and said firmly, "You need to come with me. Now." It wasn't a conversation, it was an order. Marcus looked at him for a second longer, then nodded. Not because he agreed, but because he knew there was no point in resisting, for now. He followed. Quietly. Not because he was guilty, but because sometimes, silence was the only shield he had. The office felt sterile, too clean, too quiet. A place built for order, not for questions. Marcus stepped inside behind the principal, his footsteps soft against the polished floor. The room had that institutional chill, part air conditioning, part indifference. No one smiled, no one greeted him. "Sit down," the principal said, pointing toward a hard-backed chair by the wall. No explanation, no effort to ease the tension. Marcus sat. He didn't argue. He placed his notebook carefully on his lap, fingers folded over the edge, shoulders still. His eyes moved, not nervously, but cautiously, reading faces, scanning exits, absorbing details like someone who's had to do this before. The principal moved behind the desk, picked up the receiver, and punched in a number. His voice was clipped, efficient. Not angry, just certain. "Yeah, I've got a student here. Says he's new, no ID, no schedule. Can someone from security come take a look?" A short pause. Then he added, "I don't know if he's even enrolled. We need to be careful." He hung up without looking up. The words lingered. "We need to be careful." Marcus said nothing. He could feel the weight of every syllable. Not just the ones spoken aloud, but the ones left hanging in the air. Careful of what? Of who? A woman in a pencil skirt passed by the open office door, paused, then turned in. She glanced at Marcus, then at the principal. "What's going on?" "He walked in without ID," the principal answered, shrugging. "Didn't know where to go. Claims he's a transfer." She raised an eyebrow. "And he doesn't have anything to prove it?" "Nothing," he replied. Neither of them asked Marcus directly. They talked around him, over him, as if he weren't in the room at all. Another staff member entered, slightly older, with glasses perched low on his nose. He gave Marcus a slow look, then asked, was he wandering the halls? The principal nodded. The man sighed. "Figures. Probably one of those last-minute enrollments. No structure at home." Marcus kept his posture still. He wanted to flinch, but didn't. His heart beat faster, but his face gave nothing away. They didn't check his name, didn't pull up the student database, didn't call the front desk. They assumed. They filled in the blanks with bias, not facts. "Look at how he's dressed," one of them muttered. "That's not Northbridge standard." "And that attitude," another added. "He hasn't said a word." Marcus heard it all. They saw silence as defiance. They saw a hoodie as disrespect. They saw his stillness as a threat. But he wasn't being defiant. He was surviving. He sat quietly, not because he didn't have anything to say, but because everything he said would be filtered through their assumptions. So he waited. Not with fear, but with something colder. Something learned. Because in a place like this, when they decide who you are before they know your name, Sometimes silence is the loudest thing you can offer. The hallway outside the main office had become a stage. Not officially, not with lights or curtains, but with eyes. Eyes that stared just long enough to form opinions, then looked away before they had to be responsible for them. What started as a passing moment, a boy sitting in an office chair, was now a full-blown story in motion. A group of freshmen walked by in a tight cluster, whispering. One of them had seen Marcus earlier, standing at the intersection between two halls, looking lost. She added detail to what she thought she saw. He wasn't even in uniform. Just walked in like he owned the place. Another added, "My cousin says that's how fights usually start. Some outsider thinks he can do whatever he wants." There had been no fight. No raised voice. No defiance. But the version that spread had its own rules, and truth wasn't one of them. In the junior hallway, someone scrolled through their phone and held it up for their friends. The photo of Marcus, taken through the narrow window of the office door, was already shared dozens of times. It showed him sitting in silence, back straight, notebook in his lap. But the comments underneath didn't match the image. Troublemaker already. New kid caught stealing. I bet he's not even supposed to be here. No one asked where the photo came from. No one cared whether it was accurate. A teacher passed by and glanced at the screen but said nothing. In the staff lounge, the murmurs took on a different tone. A para-educator sipped her coffee and said, "I think he's one of those late transfers. The ones the district never properly vets." Another nodded, "They just show up. And we're supposed to fix everything." By the front desk, a secretary glanced toward the office door and lowered her voice, "I don't think he's on our list. Doesn't look like he belongs here anyway." Her colleague didn't respond, just sighed, and went back to typing. Inside the office, Marcus sat exactly as he had before. He hadn't moved much. But he was no longer just a student waiting. He was an object of speculation. A blank page others were eager to fill in, even if they never bothered to ask for his name. He heard the words. Not just the ones spoken loudly, but the ones meant to be half heard. The snide remarks. The sideways jokes. The phrases wrapped in politeness but soaked in prejudice. "He's so quiet. That's always the dangerous kind. Doesn't even try to explain himself. Maybe he's not used to structure." They didn't say them to him, but they said them near him. Deliberately. As if to test whether he'd react. But Marcus didn't. Not because he didn't feel it, but because he did. Too deeply. Too often. He had been here before, if not in this exact building, then in spaces that looked just like it. Where silence could either be a defense or a sentence. Where the wrong word, the wrong tone, even the wrong breath could turn a misunderstanding into something worse. So he sat still. His posture upright. His mind alert. His dignity intact. Because while they were building a story around him, he was building something else, a memory. A moment he would carry. One he would never forget. They thought they were watching him. But he was watching them too. The atmosphere inside the office had shifted. The quiet tension from before was still there, but now it carried something more pointed, something sharper. The principal leaned forward in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin, as if preparing to deliver a verdict. He looked directly at Marcus and spoke with the calm confidence of someone used to being the final word in the room. "Let me be clear," he began, "you've already made this difficult. You show up without identification, without clearance, and no one can confirm your enrollment." His tone darkened. "Now, I don't know who sent you, or what you thought would happen when you just walked in here like you belonged. But this doesn't look good." Marcus said nothing. His hands remained folded over the notebook in his lap, unmoving. His face gave nothing away. He simply watched. The principal kept going. We've had incidents before, you know. People pretending to be students. People slipping into buildings where they don't belong. And when something happens, everyone wants to know why I didn't act sooner. He leaned back slightly, waiting for a reaction. Marcus blinked once, slowly, but stayed silent. I'm giving you a chance here, the principal continued. If you come clean now, tell me who you really are, we might avoid calling law enforcement. But if you keep playing games, I have no choice. A beat of silence. Then he added, his voice a shade colder, we're talking suspension. Or worse. Marcus looked at him evenly. There was no defiance, no visible emotion. Just that same steady calm. Then he spoke, voice low, deliberate. I'd like to make a phone call. The words were simple, but they landed hard. The principal stared at him, confused for a second, then let out a short, humorless laugh. You'd like to make a phone call, he repeated, leaning back with disbelief. What is this, some kind of television drama? You don't get a phone call. This isn't a police station. Marcus didn't smile. He didn't argue. He simply said again, I'd still like to make a call. The words didn't come from arrogance. They came from certainty. He wasn't threatening. He wasn't begging. He was simply stating what came next. The room, which had felt so tightly controlled by the principal's authority, shifted. Subtly, but unmistakably. One of the administrative staff, who had been pretending not to listen, glanced up from her computer. Another paused outside the door, sensing something different in the air. The principal's smirk faded. For the first time, there was hesitation in his posture. The confidence that had carried every word he spoke since Marcus walked in seemed to falter. And all Marcus had done was speak calmly. Twice. He hadn't raised his voice. Hadn't moved from his chair. Hadn't explained who he was. But the power in the room had tilted. Just enough for people to feel it. And in that silence, in that pause that followed his quiet insistence, something important began to crack. The office had grown still. Not the kind of stillness that comes from resolution, but the kind that follows a shift no one was prepared for. The principal stood behind his desk, arms crossed tighter than before, eyes fixed on Marcus, but his authority no longer felt rooted. Marcus moved slowly, reaching into the front pocket of his hoodie. His movements were deliberate, careful, not just out of calm but because he knew, in a space like this, sudden motions were often seen as threats. His fingers wrapped around his phone. The screen lit up as he unlocked it, then he scrolled through his contacts with practiced ease. No hesitation. No second guesses. He found the number, tapped it, and let it ring. The principal watched him, arms slowly uncrossing, posture shifting. Something had changed. It wasn't fear, not yet. But it was the beginning of doubt. The phone rang twice more. Marcus stepped forward, extending it toward the principal. His voice was steady when he spoke, I think you should take this. For a moment, the principal didn't move. Then, as if unable to stop himself, he reached out and took the device. He brought it to his ear. Hello, this is Principal Grayson, he said, his tone clipped, as though he still believed he had the upper hand. There was a pause on the other end. Long enough to make the room hold its breath. Then a voice answered. It was calm, but filled the space with quiet power. Deep, controlled, direct. The kind of voice used to being heard, used to making decisions, used to being respected. Is Marcus with you? The voice asked. Grayson blinked. Yes, he is. Another pause, this one sharper. That student, the voice said slowly, is my son. There was no emotion in the delivery. No need for volume. The words were precise, cold, undeniable. They hung in the air like the final line of a verdict. The room fell into absolute silence. The secretary froze mid-typing. A staff member just outside the door stopped walking. Even the faint hum of the overhead light seemed to dim. The balance of power, once so firmly held by the principal, dissolved in an instant. Grayson's face changed. His jaw tightened. His posture faltered. His hand holding the phone dropped slightly, like it had become heavier. He turned slowly to look at Marcus, now seeing him not as a nameless student or an intruder, but as someone connected, someone protected, someone with a presence he had grossly underestimated. Marcus didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just stood still, meeting the principal's gaze without a trace of emotion. There was no satisfaction, no anger. Only clarity. The principal opened his mouth as if to say something, but nothing came out. Because what could he possibly say? Everything he had assumed. Everything he had accused. Everything he believed he was in control of, it all unraveled with one sentence. Marcus didn't need to speak anymore. The truth had arrived. And for the first time all day, it was the only voice that mattered. The silence after the call wasn't empty. It was full of realization. The kind that arrives slowly, but presses hard. The principal still held the phone, though it was no longer pressed to his ear. His grip had weakened. His shoulders, once squared with authority, had begun to lower. There was a shift in the room, subtle but undeniable. Something had broken, and everyone knew it. Marcus didn't speak. He reached into his backpack with calm precision and pulled out a document, neatly folded, clean at the edges. He stepped forward, laid it gently on the desk in front of the principal, then returned to where he had been standing. Not a word passed his lips. The principal looked down at the paper. At first, he didn't touch it. He stared like it might confirm a truth he wasn't ready to face. Finally, he reached for it, unfolded it, and his eyes scanned the top line. There it was. The official school district seal, stamped in dark blue ink. Beneath it, a heading typed in bold letters. District Transfer Confirmation. He kept reading. The document stated that Marcus Elijah Daniels had officially been transferred to Northbridge Academy, effective as of the first day of the academic term. It referenced enrollment logs. It included a direct approval from the district office. At the bottom, signed in clear ink, was a name that carried more weight than any accusation he had made that morning. Dr. Elijah Daniels, Superintendent of Schools. The same name that had just echoed through the phone a few minutes earlier. The principal blinked, then read the letter again. His hands didn't tremble, but they weren't steady. He cleared his throat, not because he had something to say, but because silence was becoming too loud to sit in. His eyes lifted to Marcus. He seemed to be searching for something, an opening, a word, maybe a way to rewind what had just happened. But Marcus didn't move. He stood still, quiet, observing. Not with hostility. Not even with judgment. Just watching. Just present. His face unreadable, not because he was trying to hide, but because there was nothing left he needed to prove. Across the room, the secretary was still frozen at her desk. Her typing had stopped minutes ago, though her fingers still hovered over the keys. One of the counselors had entered during the call, seen the look on the principal's face, and stopped in the doorway, unsure whether to speak or back away. No one said a word. The principal gently folded the paper again and placed it on the corner of his desk. He didn't meet Marcus's eyes this time. Maybe he couldn't. Marcus stepped forward, retrieved his notebook from the chair, and glanced once around the room. He didn't smile. He didn't smirk. He simply turned, walked to the door, and opened it. He left slowly. Not dragging his feet, not rushing, just moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to explain. The door clicked shut behind him. And for the first time that morning, no one had anything to say. The door had barely closed behind Marcus before the whispers began to ripple through the halls. By the time second lunch rolled around, the video had already gone viral, at least by school standards. A blurry clip, 37 seconds long, recorded through the narrow pane of the office window, showed enough. It captured the moment the principal raised his voice. It showed Marcus sitting still, calm, surrounded by adults who looked increasingly uncomfortable. And then the turning point, the quiet handoff of the phone, the shift in power, the look on the principal's face as everything changed. Students shared it in group chats, posted it to burner accounts, passed it around with captions that said more than the original footage ever could. He didn't even flinch. They really tried it, and failed. That's the superintendent's kid. The comments started to grow, not just in number but in depth. Underneath the jokes and viral reactions, something more serious took hold. Students began sharing their own experiences. Not in loud protests or formal complaints, at first, just short posts, quiet admissions, hesitant comments like, "This happened to me too," or "They've been doing this for years." And suddenly, the story wasn't just about Marcus. It was about something bigger. About patterns. About names that came up too often. About the difference in how some students were spoken to, watched, followed, or dismissed. By the end of the day, the school board had released a statement. Formal, careful, and worded like it had passed through too many hands. They announced an internal review of the incident. Reaffirmed their commitment to equity. Promised transparency. But between the lines, one thing was clear: they had been caught off guard. The next morning, the principal didn't show up. Word spread fast. He had been asked to step aside, pending investigation. No one said whether he would return. No one seemed sure if they wanted him to. In staff meetings, the tone had shifted. Some teachers spoke about the need to reflect, to reconsider how unconscious bias played out in their classrooms. Others stayed silent, clearly uneasy, unsure what to say now that the truth had become harder to ignore. A few staff members issued public apologies, short paragraphs emailed to students, or shared through the school's online platform. They didn't name Marcus, but their words carried weight. "We acknowledge the harm caused. We recognize the need to do better. We're listening now." And students were watching. Closely. Not with anger, always, but with a new sense of clarity. The school didn't fall apart. Bells still rang. Classes continued. But something beneath the surface had changed. The illusion that silence meant peace had cracked wide open. Because once the truth is seen, it can't be unseen. And once the voices start to rise, they don't go quiet again so easily. Marcus never posted about what happened. He never spoke at an assembly, never corrected the rumors, never tried to explain his side of the story. He walked through the halls like he always had, quietly, purposefully, with his head held high. But those same halls had changed. People looked at him longer now, not out of suspicion, but recognition. The whispers that once followed him had turned into space, space that was given, not taken. A nod from someone who had once avoided eye contact. A look of respect from a teacher who had doubted him. He didn't respond to any of it. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes. In class, he remained the same. Focused. Thoughtful. He answered when asked, listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words carried weight. Teachers noticed. They saw how he paid attention, not just to the lesson, but to the people around him. How he helped classmates understand difficult material without making a show of it. How he waited his turn, but never hesitated to lead when no one else stepped forward. One morning, a student stayed behind after class, frustrated over a low grade. Marcus offered to help. No spotlight, no agenda. Just a calm offer and a willingness to sit down and explain what the teacher hadn't had time to. That moment passed quietly, but it marked the beginning of something. Others started seeking him out, not because he was popular, but because he was steady. He made people feel seen. He made them feel safe. By mid-semester, his name had been written in for student government, not by himself, but by people who had watched how he carried himself when it mattered most. The vote wasn't loud, but it was clear. He was chosen because he had earned trust without ever asking for it. He became something more than a student with a powerful father. He became a figure of quiet strength. Not the kind that demands a stage, but the kind that walks into a room and commands attention without raising a voice. The kind that endures. The kind that reminds people what dignity looks like when it's tested. He didn't change who he was. He didn't let the moment define him. He let his actions speak, and they spoke louder than anything said about him. And in that quiet, in the absence of self-defense or performance, something powerful emerged. A legacy not built by force, but by restraint. A kind of victory that doesn't shout, but stays. What lingered long after the incident wasn't the tension, the embarrassment, or even the viral moment that spread through the school. It was something quieter, something slower. It was the way people began to reflect, not just on Marcus, but on themselves. He never once tried to reclaim the space by force. He didn't defend himself with grand speeches or accusations. He simply stood in truth, unshaken, and let others reveal who they were. And that was the lesson: true power doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't need to dominate a room to be felt. Sometimes, the strongest presence is the one that speaks least. People realized how quickly they had judged him, how easily assumptions had replaced understanding. They saw how a single moment, walking in with no ID, wearing a hoodie, saying little, was enough to decide his worth in their eyes. But assumptions are shallow. They distort what's real. They keep us from seeing character, from recognizing grace, from knowing depth. Marcus didn't ask for respect. He gave it, even when he wasn't given the same in return. And in doing so, he revealed how respect should work. It shouldn't be a reward for title, or status, or popularity. It should be something we extend first. Freely. Because withholding it until someone proves themselves says more about us than them. And then there was the silence. Not the kind forced by fear, but the kind chosen out of strength. In a room full of assumptions and control, Marcus didn't yell. He didn't plead. He stayed grounded. Still. Focused. And somehow, that silence cut deeper than any argument could. His humility wasn't passivity. It was restraint. It was clarity. It was the knowledge that who he was didn't need anyone's permission. And that's what changed everything, not just the course of that day, but the way people would see quiet strength from that point on. Because once you've witnessed humility in action, real and unwavering, it stays with you. It teaches louder than words ever could. This wasn't just a story about a mistake. It was about a moment that revealed how quickly we judge, how easily we assume, and how rarely we pause to look deeper. What happened to Marcus could have happened to anyone who looks different, speaks less, or walks through the wrong door at the wrong time. But it doesn't have to keep happening. Each of us has a role to play in what comes next. And it begins with the simplest, most human act, choosing to treat others with dignity. Not after credentials are shown. Not after status is revealed. But from the very beginning. Because dignity should never be earned. It should be given freely, as a reflection of our own character, not theirs. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Share it. Let it start a conversation, with a friend, a classmate, a colleague. Let it remind people that what we assume in a second can take years to undo. That harm doesn't always come from loud voices. Sometimes it comes from silence, from indifference, from the choice not to ask a single question. Before judging by appearance, pause. Take one extra second. Think about what might be behind the expression, the clothes, the silence. You never know what story a person carries until you take the time to hear it. And when you witness injustice, big or small, don't wait for someone else to speak. Be the one who interrupts it. Your voice doesn't have to be loud, but it does have to be present. Because when no one speaks, the harm continues. But when one person does, others find the courage to follow. If you believe stories like this matter, stories that reveal, that reflect, that challenge, then stay with us. Subscribe, follow, and help us keep telling them. Not for clicks. Not for attention. But because truth deserves to be seen. And people deserve to be known beyond first impressions. Change doesn't happen all at once. It happens when one person decides to see more clearly. Be that person. Start here. Start now.